You all would be surprised to learn how much I had to bribe him to say these things. But on a more serious note, thank you for that great introduction. The personal part I didn't know about explicitly, but it's very moving to have someone to say that about you while you're still alive. And you know, I don't buy this stuff about being no legend now, come on. I want to, first of all, let me just say that I'm very pleased to be here at Villanova. I've never been here before. I've happily pulled against you all in basketball before, but, and y'all won too, by the way. But I want to thank Professors Peter Knapp and Glenn Bracey for asking me to come and for navigating all the logistics for me being here. And I want to thank all of the faculty and especially the students who are here. I remember being a student you all's age, and I had a lot of more interesting things to do than a talk at 6:30 in the evening, and so I know that you have sacrificed to come and to participate. So then, drawing from my book, The Scholar Denied, my address highlights the multiple roles that W.E.B. Du Bois played as a scholar, a founder of scientific sociology, and a major activist of the 20th century. My key message is this: there are major lessons that we can learn from Du Bois's long and distinguished career as we confront the difficult years ahead in this country. And I'm here to tell you, there are going to be some difficult years ahead. Du Bois began his groundbreaking scholarship and activism in the last decade of the 19th century, and he continued up until his death in 1963, which occurred on the eve of the Great March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech. So then there is an intriguing, well-kept secret regarding the founding of scientific sociology in America. A black professor located in a small, economically poor black university founded the first school of American scientific sociology. During the first decades of the 20th century, the black sociologist and activist W.E.B. Du Bois developed the first scientific school of sociology at a historically black school, Atlanta University. So then my purpose in writing The Scholar Denied is to shift our understanding of the founding over 100 years ago of one of the major social sciences in America. Current accounts claim that white male scholars at prestigious white universities were the exclusive founders of American scientific sociology. In these accounts, black social scientists and black universities were not even marginal contributors to the development of scientific sociology. Yet, these narratives are inaccurate because they fail to acknowledge, even mention to this day, the foundational role of Du Bois and his Atlanta School of Sociology, that role as a pioneering school of scientific sociology. Indeed, if Du Bois's innovative ideas and methodologies were at the center of sociology a century ago, they would have provided powerful theoretical and methodological directions for this new social science. The denial of Du Bois' scholarship impoverished sociology, and it impoverished social science. So by situating Du Bois' scholarship at the center of sociology and social science, I challenge existing paradigms, disrupt dominant narratives, and illuminate new truths. I hope to convince you that social science can be an emancipatory discipline, important to activism, for it can illuminate paths to social change and empower activists pursuing social change. Although we view the social sciences as long-standing institutions, they arose just a decade before the 20th century. The first sociology department was founded at the University of Chicago in 1892. Chicago sociologists founded the American Journal of Sociology, which was the first national journal in sociology. And it was as late as 1905 when the first National Association of Sociology was founded. Now, today it's called ASA, American Sociological Association. Back then, it was called the American Sociological Society. So think about those letters. So they decided they was a little uncomfortable and they changed it. American sociology, therefore, crystallized in the early 20th century. However, when we scrutinize early American sociology, it becomes very clear that it was not very scientific. The earliest sociologists did not develop empirical methodologies and failed to collect data to support their scholarship. When we think of sociology today, we have in mind studies where surveys are administered, interviews conducted, field work undertaken, and quantitative and qualitative data are utilized to document and interpret the human experience. Today, the social scientists cannot claim, my studies are valid because I have a PhD from some elite institution or that I was an undergraduate at Villanova. Or that my opinions are accurate because they are based on my own deep thoughts. Contemporary sociologists are expected to test theories with empirical data and make that data available so other scholars can reach independent conclusions. Yet this did not happen in early American sociology. Most of that sociology was essentially social philosophy because it relied on armchair theorizing of what Du Bois referred to as car window sociology, signifying that it was based on casual observations obtained while gazing from the window of a fast-moving train. Car window sociology was not rigorous because it relied on hunches, rumors, travelogues, and loosely formed opinions. Early American sociology had another feature. It was racist. When sociology emerged, American racism was rampant. By then, Jim Crow racism ushered in sharecropping and a system of peonage debt that constituted slavery by a new name. Lynching was so commonplace that it led the great jazz artist Billie Holiday to sing sadly, "Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit from the poplar trees." Blacks were stripped of the vote, starved economically, and treated as subhumans with no rights that any white person was bound to respect. These conditions caused the ex-slaves to sing, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." These troubles produced by Jim Crow triggered the civil rights movement and brought great activists on the scene to initiate an incredible war to overthrow racial injustice. This ugly racism presented America with a fundamental challenge. how could a democracy declaring, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, how could they then justify the oppression of millions of black folk? How could America justify to itself and the world that racial oppression was congruent with democracy? White Americans solved this paradox by transferring the ideology of white supremacy that was born during slavery to the Jim Crow regime. That ideology claimed blacks were an inferior race, more akin to chimpanzees than human beings. Blacks were believed to be inferior because God designed it that way. By the early 20th century, science had gained momentum as a superior mode of reasoning, but science prompted a thorny question. Was it possible that a rigorous science of race would produce evidence discrediting the ideology of black superiority? That is, would the theory of white superiority square with scientific facts? While scholars throughout academia, from the natural sciences to the humanities, biology to literature, and history to sociology, reached a solid consensus, claiming science proved that blacks were inferior. Thus, in the 20th century, white social science and white supremacist ideology walked hand in hand, justifying racial oppression. So today, it's hard for me to communicate this to you, but today it is easy to underestimate the power of the belief in black inferiority. For whites, it constituted a belief in a God-given racial superiority that was ordained by heaven. For blacks, racial inferiority meant enduring brute oppression. Moreover, when black people internalized inferiority, they were unlikely to organize mass movements to overthrow an oppression which appeared to be divine. Consciousness raising among oppressed people was one of the greatest challenges the civil rights movement faced. But then a sure-foot challenge to this racist science was soon to be launched. In the last decade of the 19th century, W.E.B. Du Bois had become a confident, brilliant, young black intellectual who was convinced that God had not made black people inferior. In an age where whites viewed blacks as inferior, Du Bois's own achievements were jarringly inconsistent with the myth of black superiority. At age 20, Du Bois earned the bachelor's degree from Fisk University. By age 22, he earned a second bachelor's from Harvard University. At age 23, he earned a master's degree from Harvard. By 25, Du Bois completed 2 years of advanced graduate studies at the University of Berlin. And at the age of 27, Du Bois became the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard. His dissertation, titled Suppression of the African Slave Trade, became the first inaugural volume of Harvard's 1896 series of historical studies. Thus, Du Bois was one of the most educated persons in the world when whites viewed blacks as inferior. Indeed, his genius, advanced education, and supreme self-confidence prepared Du Bois to become a leading scholar fully capable of attacking the lie of white superiority. However, Du Bois faced a great challenge, and that challenge was, how was he to engineer the overthrow of scientific racism? So Du Bois's scholarly preparations provided him the intellectual weapons to launch the attack. He discovered that accepted sociological knowledge was based on racial biases, deeply rooted in the souls of white scholars. Du Bois wrote, Most unfortunate is the fact that so much of the work done on the Negro question is notoriously uncritical. Uncritical from a lack of discrimination in the selection and weighing of evidence. Uncritical in choosing the proper point of view from which to study these problems. And finally, uncritical from the distinct biases in the minds of many white writers. So then for Du Bois, this biased scholarship went unchallenged because it justified white supremacy. Thus, Du Bois's challenge was to develop a new scientific sociology that unearthed the real causes of racial oppression. Du Bois's mission was clear, quote, he aimed to interject science into sociology by conducting concrete studies among actual people, his people, an oppressed race who lived and died behind the veil of racism. Du Bois argued that a scientific sociology would demonstrate that oppression caused racial inequality rather than black DNA. He declared the world was thinking wrong about race because it did not know. The ultimate evil was stupidity. For Du Bois, the problem was, in my mind, a matter of systematic investigation and intelligent understanding. Thus, Du Bois pledged to make the world think right about race by developing a scientifically based social science. Du Bois began by enumerating the scientific errors of white social scientists. First, their reasoning was not informed by history. Second, they failed to use quantitative data to carefully measure social phenomena. Third, they failed to acquaint themselves intimately with the people they studied by actually observing their daily lives and interviewing them to grasp their realities. Fourth, they did not conduct empirical studies on the population they analyzed. And fifth, and probably worst of all, they advanced racist beliefs as sociological truths. For Du Bois, all these errors produced what he calls pseudo-knowledge, masquerading as objective science. In sharp contrast, Du Bois's sociology embraced the scientific method. Having earned a doctorate from Harvard University in history, Du Bois always anchored his sociology in a historical framework. Because to understand people, you must situate them within the appropriate historical context. At the University of Berlin, Du Bois mastered quantitative research and ethnographic methodology by conducting empirical studies. So that after he completed his studies, after leaving his training in Germany, Du Bois, in his own words, dropped back into nigger-hating America to conduct empirical studies of African Americans, boldly confronting scientific racism. So, in this sense, Du Bois's plan of study departed radically from white social scientists whose theories about race emerged full-blown from their minds, given that they never left their office to conduct research. Thus, Du Bois critically challenged white card winner sociology. For example, he scolded the prominent Cornell University economist Walter Wilcox, informing him, quote, "The fundamental difficulty in your position is that you are trying to show an evaluation of the Negro problem only from inside your office. It can never be done. If you must go on writing on this problem, why not study it? Not from a car window, but get down here and really study it firsthand," end quote. In contrast, Du Bois often resided in communities that he studied, literally interviewing and surveying thousands of people. Thus, Du Bois developed a scientific and emancipatory sociology of African Americans and race inequality that was going to prove very valuable to the civil rights movement. Later on, I'm going to talk about how King praised Du Bois for giving them guidance in the civil rights movement. Du Bois's sociology theorized that modernity was a product of the African slave trade. centuries of slavery and colonialism. These oppressive systems made available exploitable labor forces and raw materials that Western bourgeoisies utilized to develop modern capitalism. So that for Du Bois, unlike Karl Marx and Max Weber and many others, for Du Bois, racial inequality was an important determinant of modern capitalism. Du Bois interrogated the global color line, explaining how it produced racial stratification in the entire world. The color line, Du Bois famously predicted, was going to be the problem of the 20th century. That color line structured the relations of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa and the Americas and the islands of the sea. I would ask you to give thought to what is the role of race in the 21st century. What is the role of race in Jerusalem? Du Bois formulated a theory of the self. Through the concept of double consciousness, he analyzed how the self, how we think of ourselves, our identity, was socially constructed through social interactions and communications. Moreover, Du Bois's formulation of the self was shaped by race and power. Du Bois also analyzed, now we talk about race, class, gender. Well, Du Bois analyzed class, race, and gender interactions. Thus, he foreshadowed the intersectionality and critical race paradigms. Du Bois was among the first theorists to theorize how people's social positions shape their lived experiences. Thus, Du Bois's sociology developed analysis from the perspective of the oppressed. His sociology of black people proceeded from a profound question: how does it feel to be a problem? From this perspective, Du Bois identified the sources of creativity and organizational strength which black people organized movements to liberate themselves. So then Du Bois's emancipatory sociology demonstrated this about the black community, that African Americans were equal to other races because racial oppression, rather than biological traits, regulated blacks to the bottom of the social order. That there was no such thing, and think about how we think of this today, that there was no such thing as black crime, because social conditions and not racial characteristics produce crime. That the black community was heterogeneous, consisting of various social classes and diverse experiences. And this is important because in the early days of sociology, white sociologists saw blacks as just one homogeneous mass. That the black church was a central institution that served as the organizational and cultural umbrella of the black community. Long before the civil rights movement, Du Bois predicted that a black movement situated in the mass-based black church would arise to overthrow racial inequality. So that breaking radically from the accepted wisdom, Du Bois predicted that the creative and organizational capacities of black people would change their history. Thus, Du Bois emerged as the first American sociologist to articulate the agency of the oppressed, not believing that change would always come from the top, not believing that no change would happen if white people did not make it happen, but that within the black community and within black people, they had the agency to help liberate themselves. Thus, Du Bois created a scientifically rigorous and emancipatory sociology. 2 decades before the Chicago School conducted empirical studies, Du Bois and his Atlanta school executed numerous empirical studies on rural and urban population. Indeed, while the Chicago School is credited with founding urban sociology in the 1920s, Du Bois's 1899 book, The Philadelphia Negro, was really the first masterpiece of empirical urban sociology. To be sure, Du Bois pioneered both rural and urban sociology And doing so, he revealed the existence of black agency in each location from which the civil rights movement would take root. Moreover, Du Bois was surely among the first American social scientists to develop a structural analysis of social inequality that emphasized racial discrimination and oppression. This approach contrasted sharply with white scholars who advanced biological explanations of race. Nevertheless, white sociologists ignored Du Bois's pioneering scholarship. In fact, Chicago sociologists of the 1920s promoted themselves as the founder of empirical sociology and race studies. However, there is one fact that cannot be overturned. Du Bois, from his early scientific studies, emerged as the first number crunching, surveying, interviewing, and participant observing and field working sociologist in America. Now, Du Bois did not create this new scientific sociology alone. Unforgotten scholars and students, heretofore erased from the very history of sociology, were central in developing Du Bois's Atlanta School of Sociology. Du Bois researchers included professional sociologists, undergraduate and graduate students, alumni of historically black colleges and universities, and community leaders. These researchers conducted field work in numerous communities where they collected data on rural cotton pickers and urban city slickers and anybody else who was around. So let me provide just a few examples for you. Monroe Work, who earned a master's degree in sociology from the University of Chicago in 1903 and became the first African American to publish in the American Journal of Sociology in 1900, became a prolific member of Du Bois's research team. He published numerous important sociological studies. And I could go across this country to major sociology departments and ask them about Monroe Work, and they will never have heard of him. Same thing, Richard R. Wright, the first African American to earn a doctorate in sociology right down the road at the University of Pennsylvania in 1911, also participated in Du Bois's research projects and published pioneering sociological studies. Edmund Haynes, the first African American to earn a doctorate in sociology at Columbia University in 1912, and co-founder of the National Urban League, became a key member of Du Bois's team and published numerous sociological studies. Thus, Du Bois assembled a team of scholars, students, and community leaders who conducted research, presented it at conferences, and wrote scholarly papers. It was this cadre of politically engaged researchers who were erased from the history of sociology that constituted the Atlanta School of Sociology. These scholars were activist scientists who sought solutions to oppression. Now move to science and activism. A month before Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, he acknowledged the enormous contribution that Du Bois made to sociology and the Black freedom movement. King grasped the importance of sociological analysis, given that he earned a bachelor's in sociology at Morehouse College, given that his close associate and best friend, Ralph Abernathy, earned a master's degree in sociology at Atlanta University. So King was acutely aware of the devastating effects that internalized inferiority had on the Black struggle. He argued, this is King, he argued, one of the great liabilities of life is that all too many people find themselves living amid a great period of social change, and yet they fail to develop the new attitudes, the new mental responses that the new situation demands. King concluded they end up sleeping through a revolution. King realized that the myth of Black inferiority would have been far greater if Du Bois's scholarship had not exposed it as a fiction. So King insisted, quote, "One idea Du Bois insistently taught was that black people have been kept in oppression and deprivation by a poisonous fog of lies. The twisted logic ran, if the black man was inferior, he was not oppressed. His place in society was appropriate to his meager talent and intellect. Dr. Du Bois recognized that the keystone in the arch of oppression was the myth of inferiority, and he dedicated his brilliant talents to demolish it." And then King revealed that Du Bois, in his 1935 study, Black Reconstruction, refuted scientific lies about black inferiority by documenting how black people played crucial roles in achieving their own liberation during slavery and Reconstruction. Quote, "Dr. Du Bois confronted this powerful structure of historical distortion and dismantled it. He virtually, before anyone else, and more than anyone else, demolished the lies about Negroes in their most important and creative period of history. The truths he revealed are not the property of all Americans." But then King said this, but, speaking of Du Bois's scholarship and his truth, but they have been recorded, and they arm us for our contemporary battles. So Dr. King was disappointed with the paucity of knowledge social science provided for the civil rights movement. He said that the social scientists played little or no role in disclosing truths. The Negro action movement was raw courage on the part of black people. They did it virtually alone. So that for King, Du Bois's scholarship provided crucial knowledge for the movement. So that in 1968, King stated, long before sociology was a science, Du Bois was pioneering in the field of social study of Negro life and completed work on health, education, employment, urban conditions, and religion. This was at a time when scientific inquiry of Negro life was so unbelievably neglected that only one single university, Atlanta University, in the entire nation had such a program, and it was funded with $5,000. And this was at a time when the University of Chicago sociology was receiving as much as $50,000 for one research project. So what is extremely relevant today is that Du Bois demonstrated how scholarship and activism could marry and produce great periods of social change. There is a profound lesson. While most scholars remain cloistered in the ivory tower, fearing political involvement contaminates scholarship, Du Bois demanded and demonstrated that this was pure nonsense. Because for him, the purpose of rigorous science is to produce knowledge useful to liberation struggles. So Du Bois, together with activists of his day, developed a blueprint that made the modern civil rights movement possible. As Du Bois wrote and researched, he marched on to the battlefield, leading important movements for justice. King was aware of this debt to Du Bois. He says, history is taught Du Bois, it is not enough for people to be angry. It's not enough to be angry in the Trump period. The supreme task is to organize and unite people so that their anger becomes a transforming force. So while the scholar activist role is often difficult to manage, King reveals that given Du Bois's prolific scholarship and prolific activism, the two roles can be enacted successfully because, as King stated, quote, "It was never possible to know where the scholar Du Bois ended and the organizer Du Bois began. The two qualities in him were a single unified force. Thus, Du Bois provided a new model for scholars, and I would say students and activists wishing to understand and change the world by demonstrating that it was possible to be a first-rank scholar and a prodigious activist simultaneously. Indeed, radical scholars can be change agents, despite the clamoring voices of Puritans claiming that science and protest don't mix. Du Bois's example of scholarship and activism are relevant for contemporary movements, including Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a decentralized movement organized to protest police brutality against black people and to seek racial and social equality. Mostly young people fuel Black Lives Matter. Young people, speaking directly to you students, young people, especially students, usually propel social movements. Without young people, South Africa would still be in the grips of the apartheid regime. Most successful movements utilize young people because of their flexible schedules. You know, classes Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, you know. Because of their energy, because of their idealism, and because of their innovative thinking. So not surprisingly, young people played crucial roles in the movements of Du Bois's day. So how did Du Bois respond to young black protesters? Did he advise them to embrace the politics of respectability and pursue upward mobility at any cost? Or did Du Bois advise students to initiate protests that attacked injustice head on? Du Bois's response to student protests in the 1920s at his alma mater provides shining examples of his stance. At the time, Fisk University's white president, Fisk was a black school, at the time, Fisk University's white president and his administration practiced a racially biased leadership that severely curtailed student protests aimed at addressing racism head on. Du Bois's response to the student protests in the 1920s and his alma mater showed us something. These students broke rank and rebelled. Du Bois supported the young protesters. Quote, and here again, we are always actually or potentially saying hush to children and to students. We're putting on the soft pedal. We are teaching them subterfuge and compromise. We are leading them around to the back door for fear that they shall express themselves. And yet, whenever and wherever we do this, we are wrong, absolutely and eternally wrong. Unless we are willing to train our children to be cowards, to run like dogs when they are kicked, to whine and lick the hand that slaps them. We've got to teach them self-realization and self-expression. So then while black leaders rebuked protests because of the white money that flowed into Fisk, they feared it would dry up. Du Bois thundered, dignity and self-expression were far more precious than basketfuls of white dollars. When Du Bois learned of additional student protests, he embraced the politics of disruption. Quote, and again, for a second time, and with no advice for instigation from without, the students rioted and struck. They pounded ash cans. They sang. And they yelled. And they broke windows. I thank God that they did. I thank God that the younger generation of black students have the guts to yell and fight when they are insulted, mocked, and oppressed. A spontaneous rebellion of young and hurt souls who refuse to submit to calculated and remorseless tyranny is a splendid and a heartening thing. So then, Du Bois, the Harvard man, renowned author, organizers of African people worldwide, leader of the NAACP, he stood in solidarity with protesting students yelling and breaking windows. Moreover, Du Bois encouraged radicalism for change because he saw the protesters as a, quote, the real radical, the man who hits power in high places while power, backed by unlimited wealth, hits it and hits it openly in between the eyes. the black students talked face to face and not down at the big gate. And then Du Bois concluded, God speed the breed. Now, I've reached my conclusions now, and it's a few of you that have grown up in the black church. When the preacher said he was reaching his conclusions, it meant that he was at least a third of the way through his sermon. You did a little preaching. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? What can universities across the globe and here at Villanova, what can they do to advance the work of Du Bois and King and contemporary freedom fighters struggling to make democracy a reality in the age of Trump? First, it is time to vanish the myth that a group of white male sociologists at the University of Chicago founded American scientific sociology. The Du Bois Atlanta School of Sociology should be recognized as the founder of modern scientific sociology. And Du Boisian scholarship, that of other important black scholars and oppressed people around the world, they should be infused throughout the curriculum of American universities, so that to have a vibrant and relevant academy, it is crucial that people of color and the poor must be recruited into our universities, so all ideas are brought to the table. And so while the Supreme Court is going to move to strike down affirmative action, and while students of color are diminished and chased away from these universities, what I want to say to you tonight is that it is us who remain behind who will be impoverished in thought and in action. We know that the way in which new ideas hit the table and come to fruition is by having people with different perspectives, different backgrounds at the table, and let the ideas clash and fly. Then we will have a strong and vibrant university. Moreover, as Du Bois demonstrated, the false dichotomy proclaiming scholarship and activism as polar opposites should be rejected. By so doing, we can establish the social sciences as an emancipatory field, excelling in the scientific scholarship, while unleashing social truths that can empower social change agents. Finally, in these troubling times, I think that we need to recommit ourselves to developing an emancipatory social science and to advance the mission of the civil rights movement and all those other democratic movements that were inspired by the civil rights movement. By this, I mean the mission to establish universal liberation so that all people from across the globe can become empowered citizens. It is not enough to have King Day. It is not enough to have one speaker talking about King. It's not enough to have university presidents and dean come out for a half an hour and talk about how great King was. That accomplished little. In fact, most of these people opposed King in the last years of his life when he was calling for economic redistribution of income and wealth in America. So by this I mean the mission, we need to go back to the mission to establish universal liberation for all people. In so doing, we can promote the democratic vision of W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and all of us can engage in the fight to free humanity. As the great civil rights leader, Ella Jo Baker declared, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." Thank you. Okay, Professor want me to take questions, and I wouldn't dare not follow his orders. So let's go.
All right. The questions, please keep them short and to the point if possible. But who's first? Anna.
I have a question about your thoughts behind leadership, because I see like in the civil rights movement, like there were like clear, explicit leaders, and in the movements like I've been looking at this semester, like the Me Too movement or like the Black Lives Matter movement, like the Me Too movement doesn't really have any leadership at all currently, and the Black Lives Matter is taking a decentralized approach. Do you think that that's going to prove efficient, or do you think that today's movement's the exclusion?
It is a very profound question. And I really have a kind of mixed sort of view. I think that it is wonderful that movements now seek to be decentralized, not have centralized leadership, because they say that those movements can become authoritarian. You know, a lot of email messages at the end, they have this saying by Gandhi, be the change that you want to see. And so the idea there being that if you organize yourself in a hierarchical manner and you have centralized leadership and so forth, that you can't bring about democracy, because democracy is not about having one or two leaders dictating and so forth. I think that that's very important. It was that kind of leadership was apparent in the Occupy movement, certainly in Black Lives Matter to some extent. But I believe, in my studies of social movements, I believe that you need some organized leadership. I think the real problem with leadership in social movements often is that you don't have accountability structures. And then you can't hold leaders accountable to the goals of the masses and so forth. And so you need accountability structures. One of the reasons why you have all these decentralized movements today is that they argue. And many of the people who came out of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee argued this. They argued that Martin Luther King was this charismatic figure that dominated the movement and dictated to the movement. I largely disagree with that position. First of all, when you study social movements, you will find that charisma does matter. It matters in the organizational process. It matters in the mobilization process. When King would go into a town where a movement had started, it was fizzling, the masses weren't coming out. King come to town, and thousands of people showed up. And then they had the organizers who took their name and recruited them into the movement. Also, King, as a charismatic leader, was able to articulate to America and to the world how it was failing as a democracy. So that I think that what we see is that these movements that are highly decentralized, with no recognized leaders, no clear-cut demands, that they don't last long. They aren't able to sustain themselves. And so what I would argue for would be a dynamic mixture between leadership and decentralization. I think that that is possible. Martin Luther King, once again, just to try to illuminate this, Martin Luther King had one of the most amazing leadership teams. People with all kinds of different perspectives. Some were white, some came out of communist backgrounds, some were conservative, some were radical, and what King would do is let them argue and fight. There were literally times where they got into physical fights, and King would sit there. He didn't act too nonviolent during those moments. He let them fight. until he heard what could be creative solutions to the issues that they were dealing with. Then he would synthesize that information and move on. It is totally inconsistent to portray Martin Luther King as if he was this one lone individual that was a magician. He had creative, powerful chapters of the movement all across the nation. So I think this notion that King was this great charismatic leader, but he wasn't an organizer. He wasn't a mobilizer. It's just not the truth. So I want to say this though. There is no easy solution to this problem. I'm not trying to tell you that, it's easy to figure that out. That has to be determined on the ground, but I come away believing that there has to be some kind of great synthesis that comes out of the creativity of bringing together leaders, organizers, and setting concrete goals. Otherwise, the movement will dissipate.
First, is there a second question? I'll call on a few at a time. Well, go ahead, and then if y'all can correct other questions.
Dr. Morris, my name is Frank Pryor. I've been teaching here in the political science department at Villanova for the last 21 years.
21 years.
I really respect your scholarship. You guys remind me of one of my heroes, the late great Haynes Walton.
Yes, I knew Haynes.
I do have a two-part question. You described the Bois as being part of an intellectual dream team. So one of the things that I've always wanted, and by the way, I pulled this off the shelf. I've had it since I've been an undergraduate.
Good.
One of the things I wanted to know why Du Bois wasn't selected for the research by the Carnegie Foundation, that Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish economist, was selected to author An American Dilemma. What were some of the barriers that Du Bois faced, and why couldn't he have been selected for that? That's number one. And then number two, one of the things that's argued in that work by Myrdal is that democracy would prevail over racism. Can you give that the 21st century treatment and let us know if you agree with that or not?
Yes. At the risk of sounding like a pure promotionalist, I would tell you that I have a whole chapter in The Scholar Denied as to what happened that Du Bois was denied to do the study, and that Gunnar Myrdal was brought in. So that Du Bois had been trying to get money from the Carnegie Foundation and many others to do a major encyclopedia of black people across the diaspora. And he was constantly turned down. And then during World War II and the end of World War II, there were those who wanted, powerful whites who wanted a study of race relations in the United States. The argument that important white scholars in universities made, scholars that we think of as very progressive, such as Melville Herskovits, who was a founder of the African Studies Association. They argue that Du Bois could not, being a Negro, that he could not be objective, that he would have racial bias. And so they decided that they would recruit, they wouldn't call it this, but a white man from Europe who didn't have no biases. Imagine that. Coming out of societies that had colonized most of the world, but that he would come with no biases. And so there was a very concerted effort to make sure that Du Bois did not get the money to conduct the study that Myrdal did, which became An American Dilemma. And the thing is that I was talking to a faculty group today, and I said that what is so interesting about this is that those who claim to be objective, without bias, they were the ones that advanced some of the most racist agendas going in their scholarship. But what they argued is that that black people being inferior, and of course emotional, that they should not get the money to do a major study on black people. Now, and so they gave it to Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish economist. Now, what did we get out of American Dilemma? What we got out of American Dilemma, first of all, there's a lot of great stuff in the book. I mean, it analyzed the black community pretty well, but amazingly, Gunnar Myrdal found that black people belong to more organizations than their white people. Now, rather than him interpreting that data is that they therefore had organizational capacity in the white community, he argued that it was that black people were just exaggerated Americans. They were trying to be white by joining. Saw nothing positive, nothing there that could organize and sustain a movement for change. Du Bois would have never reached such a conclusion. And so that Myrdal, the problem for Myrdal was, in terms of race, that the problem was inside the heads of white people, and that they were prejudiced, and that change would only come if white people changed their prejudice. I'll tell you all, we would still be in Jim Crow if black people waited around for white people to change their minds about the oppression and discrimination against black people. And so Du Bois, as I said in my talk, clearly revealed the agency and the capacity to generate change by black people. And so not only that, but Myrdal went on to argue that black people had a pathological culture, that they were inferior people. So then, of course, we can analyze and debate now this whole question about Myrdal's objectivity, but it certainly fell in line with the consensus among dominant white Americans that black people were inferior. So, the dream team. What was your question about the dream team again?
Well, I didn't have a question about the dream team. I just had a question about the argument that was made by Myrdal about democracy would prevail over racism.
Well, I think that once again, we would love to believe that democracy and democratic ideals will be dominant and chase away racism. I'm afraid that it's a very wishful hypothesis. I'm afraid that we now see the clock turning backwards. As I said earlier, we're going to see all of these attacks on affirmative action and keep black people and brown people out of these universities so that they can learn and try to be leaders in their communities. I think that, while we talk about this, Trump is busy putting all of these conservative judges in positions across the country. And they're going to be pushing conservative policies, and they're going to be pushing policies that's consistent with the way Trump dealt with Charlottesville. So I think that the way we get democracy in America, and I don't just mean black people and their inequalities. One of the things about Du Bois is that Du Bois saw that all forms of oppression, especially in the United States, that they are tied together. He discussed gender inequality, class inequality, race inequality, and showed how they were interlinked and how they reinforced each other. And so that the only way that progressive change happens in America is when people, ordinary people, students, clergy, workers, build grassroots movements and demand change. One of the things that I think we are mistaken, this is probably what you're not going to hear on King Day. What we're going to hear is how King had this beautiful dream, black boys and white girls holding hands together and all of this. Martin Luther King was a very shrewd tactician. We don't understand, most of us don't understand what King's strategy of nonviolence was, direct action. Now, what did that mean? What it meant is that for those of us who study social movements, where does power in a movement come from? Does it come from singing "We Shall Overcome"? Well, it helps. Does it come from having nice negotiations with the oppressor? Maybe it helps. But the backbone of the power of social movements derives from disruption. That movements get power when they disrupt the status quo. And so when King and all of the people of the movement who believed in nonviolent direct action, when they went into a town like Birmingham, Alabama, they said, we got to bring it to its knees. We got to disrupt the economy so that there's no flow of commerce. There's no profits being made. We got to cause all kinds of disruption, bring the city to a halt. By the way, the same thing happened in the anti-apartheid movement too. What did they say? Make it ungovernable. And so that the power of the civil rights movement and nonviolent direct action is that it produced disruption, caused American society not to go on as usual. And what happened is that they always tried to say to King and company, okay, look, in the demonstrations, and we'll talk. And King and them said, no, meet the demands, and we'll call off the demonstrations. And so what I'm saying is that, we might as well not be weak-kneed here in thinking that there's some sort of little loving, peaceful nonviolence that occurs in social change. No, it is social disruption of the status quo that brings about change. Now that disruption can come about in a whole lot of ways. But I tell you what, young people, students, you all would not have today the same rights as students if there had not been a Berkeley free speech movement in Berkeley, California in 1964 at Berkeley. They disrupted the university. They shut it down. They caused boycotts and all. That was the beginning of students' rights, where you could participate on certain committees you were barred from. Women students had to come in at some ridiculous curfew while the men came in pretty much when they wanted to. Same kind of gender discrimination and so forth. So the change came about because of disruption. And so what I'm saying is, there is nothing inevitable about democracy overriding racism and classism and gender inequality. It is only when the people organize grassroots movements and produce sufficient social disruption that can serve as the leverage by which to demand and get change.
We have time for maybe one more question. Does anybody want to ask the last one?
Can you talk about the reception of your book, The Scholar Denied, in the sociology communities? Because coming through and changing the entire scope of which the field has originated, I would imagine might come with some controversy.
I've never wanted to write anything that wasn't controversial. I think that to engage in scholarship that will be ignored and not paid any attention is worse than even producing it. I anticipated some negative reactions to the book. I would say that now there have been about 50 or 60 reviews of the book. And I would say that so far, 95% has been very positive. But Glenn was reminding me of a session we were at in Atlanta at the Southern Sociological Society, where one white guy got sort of irate and said, "You black people, you know, you're ungrateful for what all these great white scholars have done for you, you know." So we're the ignorant ones. And I was at a author meets critics session at the ASA, and a white guy stood up and called me all kind of lies and said that we black folks need to know when white people have done all this stuff for us. And what are you doing here? You here putting us down. Y'all need to grow up. And then the black people and a few others ran him out of the room, and I applauded. I think that I'm waiting for more pushback, to be honest with you. It's been out for 2 years now. You know, it takes a while to get in print and so forth. But yeah, I must admit, I mean, my ambition in the book is pretty huge. It is to rewrite the intellectual history of scientific sociology in America. And the part, and I'm continuing to write about this, I didn't emphasize it in the book, and maybe I should have, but the whole thing is, I'm not saying that the Chicago school, for example, didn't have something to say, didn't do anything valuable. But I am saying, you know, it's funny. When I talk about Du Bois and all of what he did in terms of scholarship and what he argued and so forth, they say, yeah, but you didn't compare him with Karl Marx and Emil Durkheim and Max Weber. And so you could really make this much more robust if you put them in the book about Du Bois. I said, okay. I said, look, you all have read hundreds of books on Marx and on Weber and on Durkheim. Have you ever seen Du Bois's name even in the book? Period. So I said, you know, my bottom line is this, is that there's no one book that is perfect. There is no, there are hundreds of stories to tell. There were so many stories that I wanted to tell. I said, oh no, that takes me off to a tangent. I can do that later. Somebody else can do it. So my favorite line has become, with some of the criticism about you should do this, you should do this, you should do that, or you should have done. I say, you know what? Sounds like a wonderful project, but it's yours, and you ought to do it. Right? I thank you all very much. I enjoyed this.